Imagine the sound of 10,000 hammers striking a single infinite sheet of copper. That is what the monsoon feels like when it finally breaks over the Punjab. In the late spring of 326 BCE, the sky above northern India did not just rain, it collapsed. For the battle-hardened veterans of Alexander the Great's army, men who had marched through the dust of Anatolia, the snows of the Hindu Kush, and the blistering heat of the Persian deserts, this was a new kind of hell. The air was a thick, suffocating soup of humidity, and the earth beneath their sandals had turned into a treacherous, sucking mire that threatened to swallow their very ambitions. They were thousands of miles from the familiar marble shores of the Aegean, standing on the threshold of a world that existed only in the half-remembered myths of their ancestors. They were at the edge of the known universe, and before them lay a barrier more formidable than any city wall they had yet encountered, the Hydaspes River. By this point in his career, Alexander of Macedon was no longer just a king. He was a living legend, a man who had systematically dismantled the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The Achaemenid Persians were gone, their king of kings, Darius, was dead, and Alexander had donned the robes of an Eastern autocrat. Yet his hunger for the Eastern Ocean, the legendary end of the world, remained unsated. He had pushed his army through the treacherous passes of the Paropamisade, fighting brutal, small-scale insurgencies in Sogdiana and Bactria, and now he had descended into the lush, fertile plains of the Five Rivers. To his men, this was a land of monsters and marvels, a place where the sun rose differently and the very trees seemed to breathe. But for Alexander, it was simply the next page in a book of conquest that he intended to finish. The political landscape of India was a fractured mosaic of warring kingdoms and tribal confederacies. As Alexander crossed the Indus, he was met not with steel but with silver. King Amphis, ruler of the great trade hub of Taxila, saw the Macedonian juggernaut approaching and chose pragmatism over martyrdom. He welcomed Alexander with open arms, offering thousands of talents of silver, sheep, and oxen, and most importantly, a contingent of his own troops. Taxila was a revelation to the Greeks, a center of learning and commerce where they encountered gymnosophists, the naked philosophers who challenged Alexander's worldview with their stoic indifference to power. However, the hospitality of Taxila came with a price. Amphis had a rival to the east, a king whose name commanded respect even from his enemies. This was Porus, the ruler of the Parava kingdom, a man whose territory lay just beyond the Hydaspes. Porus was not like the satraps of Persia who had fled at the first sight of the Macedonian Saracens. He was a giant of a man, reportedly nearly 7 feet tall, with a physical presence that mirrored the strength of his realm. When Alexander's messengers arrived at his court demanding tribute and submission, Porus's reply was curt and chilling. He would meet the Macedonian king at his borders, but he would come armed. There would be no gold offered, only iron. This defiance set the stage for what would become the most tactically complex and psychologically grueling battle of Alexander's life. As the Macedonian army marched toward the Hydaspes, the environment itself seemed to conspire against them. The river, fueled by the melting snows of the Himalayas and the relentless monsoon rains, had transformed from a navigable waterway into a churning brown monster. It was over a mile wide in places, a violent torrent of eddies and whirlpools that tossed uprooted trees like toothpicks. On the opposite bank, Porus sat waiting. He had not just brought an army, he had brought a nightmare. Lining the far shore were the war elephants of the Parava, huge, gray monoliths of muscle and rage, draped in quilted armor and carrying towers filled with archers. To the Macedonian horses, who had never seen such creatures, the scent of the elephants was a source of pure, primal terror. Alexander's cavalry, the backbone of his military machine, would be useless if the horses refused to enter the water. Alexander pitched his camp on the western bank, and for weeks, the two greatest commanders of the age engaged in a silent, deadly stare-down across the water. The logistics were seemingly impossible. To cross a river in the face of an opposing army is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in warfare. To do so against an army of elephants in a monsoon is suicide. Porus was no fool. He mirrored Alexander's every move. If the Greeks moved upstream, the elephants paced them on the other side. If the Greeks prepared rafts, the Indian archers moved into position. The Hydaspes became a liquid wall, a frontier that Alexander could not breach by force alone. The Macedonian king realized that he was being watched by a man who understood the terrain better than he ever could. Porus had calculated that the river would protect him until the rain ceased, by which time Alexander's supply lines might buckle or his men's morale might finally snap. But Alexander was a master of the psychological game. He began a campaign of systematic deception designed to dull the senses of the Parava scouts. Every night he would order his cavalry to move up and down the riverbanks. They would shout, blow trumpets, and raise the traditional Macedonian war cry, the alala, filling the night with the sounds of an imminent invasion. At first, Porus responded with total mobilization. He would wake his entire army, bring the elephants to the water's edge, and stand in the pouring rain waiting for a battle that never came. This went on for nights on end. Alexander was teaching the Indians to ignore the noise. He was conditioning them to believe that the Greeks were merely restless, paralyzed by the river and the rain. Eventually, the elephants remained in their stalls, and the sentries on the eastern bank grew complacent, huddled under their leather cloaks to escape the downpour. The The nightly noise became part of the background of the monsoon, a harmless ritual of a frustrated invader. While he projected an image of indecision, Alexander was secretly scouting for a miracle. He knew that a direct crossing at the main camp was impossible. He needed a spot where the river narrowed or was divided by an island, a place where he could hide his preparations from Porus's watchful eyes. Roughly 18 miles upstream from his main camp, near a sharp bend in the river, he found it. A headland covered in dense forest and a large wooded island in the middle of the stream offered the perfect screen. The plan was a masterpiece of misdirection. Alexander left a large portion of his army under the command of Craterus at the main camp with orders to keep the campfires burning brightly and to make as much noise as possible. He instructed Craterus not to attempt a crossing unless Porus moved his elephants away to face Alexander elsewhere. He wanted Porus to believe the main threat was still sitting right across him. Meanwhile, under the cover of a particularly violent thunderstorm, Alexander led a hand-picked force of about 11,000 elite troops on a secret night march through the sodden woods. The rain, which had been a curse for weeks, now became his greatest ally, muffling the clatter of armor and the hoofbeats of the horses. As the lightning illuminated the churning mud of the Punjab, the king moved toward his destiny, unaware that the river had one final treacherous surprise waiting for him. The surprise was a quirk of the river's geography that the Macedonian scouts had failed to detect in the gloom. As the first of the rafts scraped against what they believed to be the eastern bank, the men scrambled out into the knee-deep mud, only to realize with a sinking horror that they were not on the mainland. They had landed on another island, a long, narrow strip of silt and scrub separated from the true shore by yet another branch of the Hydaspes. This second channel, swollen by the unrelenting monsoon rains, was deeper and swifter than the one they had just crossed. The horses, already spooked by the thunder, neighed in terror as the current pulled at their legs. Alexander, never went to let momentum slip, plunged into the water first. It is said the water reached the necks of the men and the muzzles of the horses, but through sheer force of will, the elite vanguard pushed through. By the time the first rays of a gray, damp dawn broke over the horizon, Alexander had finally planted his boots on the firm soil of the Indian side. However, the secrecy of the crossing had finally evaporated. Porus's scouts patrolling the riverbank had spotted the Macedonian movement during the final stages of the crossing. They rode back with desperate haste to the Indian camp to deliver the news. Porus, however, was conflicted. He could see Craterus's massive force across the river from his original position, still making a great deal of noise and preparing their own boats. Was Alexander's crossing a mere diversion, or was the king himself leading the small force that had just made it across? Porus decided on a compromise that would prove costly. He sent a smaller force of 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots under the command of his own son to intercept the invaders, believing they were likely a scouting party or a minor detachment. This was a fatal miscalculation. When the young prince reached the landing site, he found not a small raiding party, but the seasoned core of the Macedonian army, including the legendary companion cavalry. The ground here was a nightmare for the Indian chariots. The heavy, six-man vehicles, which were the pride of the Indian military, sank deep into the rain-softened earth. They became static targets, unable to maneuver or gain the speed necessary to be effective. Alexander, seeing the struggle of the chariots, did not hesitate. He led a thunderous charge of his cavalry, hitting the Indian force before they could even form a proper line of battle. The slaughter was swift and brutal. The chariots were overturned, their drivers and archers cut down where they stood. The Indian cavalry, overwhelmed by the superior discipline and equipment of the Macedonians, broke and fled. Among the fallen was Porus's son, his body left in the mire as the survivors raced back to the main camp with the grim news. Alexander had secured his bridgehead, but the true test was only just beginning. When Porus learned of his son's death and the size of the force that had crossed the river, the gravity of the situation finally settled upon him. He could no longer afford to wait. Leaving a small portion of his army and a few elephants to watch Craterus, Porus moved the bulk of his forces to meet Alexander. He sought a piece of ground that was flat and firm enough to support his remaining chariots and, more importantly, his elephants. He eventually settled on a sandy plain near the modern village of Jalapur. It was here that he drew up his battle line, a site that would haunt the dreams of many a Macedonian veteran for years to come. At the center of the Indian line stood the elephants, nearly 200 of them, spaced at intervals of about 50 feet. To the Macedonians, who had seen elephants before at Gaugamela, but never in such concentrated numbers, they looked like a wall of gray stone, a living fortress that seemed impenetrable. Behind and between the elephants were 30,000 infantrymen, armed with massive longbows made of bamboo. These arches were supported by infantry units carrying broadswords and spears. On the wings, Porus stationed his remaining 4,000 cavalry and the rest of his chariots. Porus himself sat atop his massive war elephant, a giant of a man whose presence alone commanded respect. He was nearly 7 feet tall, and from his vantage point, he looked down upon the field with the calm resolve of a monarch who knew his land and his people were at stake. Alexander, arriving on the field with his cavalry, paused to survey the scene. His infantry, the phalanx, was still marching up and would need time to recover from the grueling night march and the river crossing.
He observed the Indian formation with a keen analytical eye. He knew that a direct frontal assault by his infantry against the center would be suicide. The horses of the Macedonian cavalry would never charge the elephants. The mere smell of the beasts would cause them to bolt in terror. Furthermore, the Indian longbows, though slowed by the dampness which made it difficult to brace their bottoms against the muddy ground, were still capable of firing heavy arrows that could pierce Macedonian shields and armor with ease. Alexander realized he had to be patient. Alexander's genius lay in his ability to adapt. He decided to exploit the one weakness he saw in Porus's massive, lumbering formation, its lack of mobility. He gathered his generals, Seleucus, Antigonus, and Conus, and outlined a plan that relied on speed and deception rather than raw power. He would not attack the center. Instead, he would concentrate the majority of his cavalry on the Indian left wing. He sent Conus with a large detachment of horsemen with secret orders to swing wide, hidden by the undulations of the terrain, and circle around to the Indian right, waiting for the perfect moment to strike from the rear. It was a classic pincer movement, but executed on a scale that few had ever attempted. The tension on the field was palpable. The rain had ceased, replaced by a humid, heavy heat that made the bronze armor of the Macedonians feel like an oven. The only sounds were the occasional trumpet of an elephant and the rhythmic clatter of the phalanx's sarissas as the infantry finally arrived and took their positions. The Macedonian soldiers, many of whom had followed Alexander from the shores of the Aegean to the edge of the known world, looked at the towering elephants and felt a primal fear. These were not men they were being asked to fight, but monsters of legend, draped in chainmail and carrying archers on their backs. Alexander rode along the front of his lines, his golden armor flashing in the sun. He spoke to his men, reminding them of their victories at Issus and Gaugamela, telling them that the river was behind them and there was no way home but through the enemy. As the sun climbed higher, Alexander gave the signal. The Agrinis, his elite light infantry and archers, moved first, peppering the Indian cavalry with a hail of javelins and arrows. This was the opening movement of a complex tactical dance. Alexander then led his companion cavalry in a sweeping arc toward the Indian left. Porus, seeing the bulk of the Macedonian horse moving toward one flank, began to shift his own cavalry from the right to reinforce his left. This was exactly what Alexander had anticipated. As the Indian cavalry moved to counter the threat, a gap began to form in their lines. The massive gears of Alexander's trap were beginning to turn, and the quiet of the Punjab was about to be shattered by the most violent clash of arms the ancient world had ever seen. The elephants began to stir, their mahouts urging them forward, as the two greatest commanders of the age finally prepared to lock horns in a struggle that would determine the fate of an empire. He signaled the charge with grim determination.
The thunder of the Macedonian charge was not a sudden explosion of noise, but a rhythmic, terrifying crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the saturated ground of the Punjab. As Alexander surged forward, his eyes were fixed not on the elephants, but on the Indian cavalry. He knew that if he could break the wings, the center would become a gilded cage for Porus's infantry. Behind him, the dust kicked up by thousands of hooves mixed with the lingering morning mist, creating a shimmering, ethereal veil over the carnage that was about to unfold. The companion cavalry, the finest shock troops of the ancient world, moved with a practiced precision that contrasted sharply with the chaotic, desperate maneuvering of the Indian squadrons. Porus, perched atop his massive command elephant, watched with growing alarm as Alexander's force angled sharply toward his left wing. He had expected a frontal assault, a head-on collision that his elephants could easily absorb and repel. Instead, the Macedonian king was refusing the center, drawing the Indian mobile forces away from their protective screen of behemoths. To counter this, Porus ordered his right-wing cavalry to gallop behind his main line to support the left. It was a logical move, a standard tactical response to a flanking maneuver, but it was exactly what Alexander had baited him into doing. Hidden from the Indian view by the undulating terrain and the screen of light infantry, the Macedonian general Conus was waiting for this precise moment. As the Indian cavalry from the right wing moved across the field, they were momentarily disordered, their formations stretched thin by the rapid redeployment. Just as they reached the left flank, Conus and his own hidden cavalry units burst from their cover. They struck the Indian horsemen in the rear and flank while Alexander hit them from the front. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Caught in a pincer of Macedonian iron, the Indian cavalry found themselves unable to charge or retreat. They were squeezed into a disorganized mass, their horses panicked by the clashing of bronze and the shrill cries of the Agrianese archers, who continued to rain projectiles into the melee. Meanwhile, the Indian chariots, which Porus had hoped would provide a decisive edge, proved to be a liability. The heavy rains had turned the riverbanks into a treacherous mire. The heavy six-man vehicles bogged down in the deep mud, their wheels sinking to the axles. The Macedonian light troops swarmed them, pulling the drivers from their seats and stabbing the horses. What should have been a mobile force of destruction became a series of stationary targets, soon discarded and left behind as the focus of the battle shifted toward the center. It was then that the most harrowing phase of the battle began. The Macedonian phalanx, the backbone of Alexander's army, began its steady, relentless advance toward the line of elephants. To the Greek soldiers, these animals were moving castles, terrifying biological tanks that stood taller than any obstacle they had ever faced. The Indian mahouts urged the beasts forward, and the elephants responded with trumpeting roars that shook the very air. They charged into the Macedonian ranks with a force that seemed unstoppable. The first contact was a scene of pure horror. The elephants used their massive tusks to impale soldiers and their trunks to snatch men from the ranks, hurling them into the air or trampling them into the blood-soaked mud. However, the Macedonians were not ordinary levies. They were veterans of a decade of constant warfare. Under Alexander's instruction, they had developed specific tactics for dealing with these giants. The phalanx opened its ranks, allowing the charging elephants to pass through corridors of spears rather than meeting them head-on. As the beasts passed, the light infantry, the Agriones and the Thracians, leapt forward with specialized weapons. They used curved axes and scythes to hack at the elephants' feet and trunks. Others focused their arrows and javelins on the mahouts, aiming to kill the drivers and leave the animals without direction. The battle soon devolved into a swirling, chaotic nightmare of meat and metal. The elephants, wounded and terrified by the constant stinging of missiles and the hacking of blades, began to lose their composure. No longer governed by the commands of their fallen mahouts, the animals turned into a neutral force of destruction. They began to recoil from the long Macedonian sarisse, the 18-foot pikes that formed an impenetrable thicket of points. In their agony and confusion, the elephants turned around and charged back through their own lines. They trampled the Indian infantry, who were packed tightly behind them, crushing their own allies underfoot. The Indian lines, which had started the day with such formidable composure, began to buckle. The compression of the battlefield was turning against Porus. Alexander's cavalry had now completely shattered the Indian horse and were driving the survivors back into the center. The Macedonian phalanx continued to push forward, their shields locked, their pikes leveling a forest of death. The Indian forces were being hemmed in from all sides. On one side was the river, on the other was the encircling Macedonian cavalry, and in front was the advancing phalanx. In the center, the maddened elephants continued to churn the mud into a bloody slurry, their massive bodies becoming obstacles that hampered the Indian soldiers more than the Greeks. The air was filled with a cacophony that defied description. The trumpeting of wounded elephants, the screams of the dying, the rhythmic clashing of shields, and the guttural shouts of the Macedonian officers. The ground was no longer recognizable as earth. It was a swamp of gore and discarded equipment. Porus himself remained in the thick of the fighting. Despite the chaos, he was a conspicuous figure, standing nearly 7 feet tall and fighting with a bravery that commanded the respect of friend and foe alike. From the height of his elephant, he continued to hurl javelins, his royal armor glinting even through the grime of the combat. He saw his sons fall, and he saw his commanders being cut down, yet he refused to yield. Alexander, observing the battle from the vantage of the flanking cavalry, saw that the climax had been reached. The Indian army was no longer an organized fighting force. It was a trapped animal, fighting with the desperation of the doomed. The fortress of flesh that Porus had constructed was now a tomb. The elephants, exhausted by loss of blood and the frantic exertion of the battle, began to slow down. Some stood still, swaying and moaning with a sound that Arrian described as being like the lowing of cattle, while others simply collapsed, their massive weight pinning scores of men beneath them. The Macedonian king knew that the time had come for the final exertion. He signaled for the phalanx to close the gaps and for the cavalry to make one last coordinated surge. The encirclement was nearly complete. The Indian infantry, armed with their longbows, found they could not even draw their weapons in the cramped conditions. The bows were too tall to be braced on the slippery, unstable ground. They were reduced to fighting with short swords against the reach of the sarisse, a hopeless contest that could only end in slaughter. The tactical genius of Alexander had turned the very strength of the Indian army, its size and its elephants, into the instruments of its own destruction. As the sun began to climb higher, casting a harsh light on the carnage, the momentum of the battle shifted irrevocably toward the invaders. The once mighty army of the Pruha kingdom was being ground into the dust of its own land.
The Macedonian phalanx, a bristling forest of 18-foot sarisse, moved forward with the rhythmic, mechanical precision that had become the hallmark of Alexander's conquests. It was no longer a battle of maneuvers. It had become a labor of attrition, a systematic harvesting of life. The rhythmic thump of the phalangites' boots on the mud, the guttural shouts of the Decadarchi keeping the files in order, and the sickening crunch of wood against bone created a cacophony that drowned out the natural sounds of the riverbank. For the Indian soldiers trapped in the center, there was no retreat. The Hydaspes roared behind them, its current swollen and unforgiving, while the Macedonian cavalry hemmed them in from the flanks. The once proud infantry of the Porava kingdom, renowned for their height and their prowess with the longbow, were now merely a dense mass of targets. Those who tried to flee toward the river were cut down by the Agranians. Those who stood their ground were impaled by the relentless wall of pikes. At the center of this maelstrom stood King Porus. He was a figure of tragic grandeur, his massive frame, reputed to be over 7 feet tall, perched atop the back of his largest remaining war elephant. While his generals fled or fell, and his sons were reportedly already among the slain, Porus remained. He did not fight like a man expecting victory, but like a sovereign who had already accepted his fate. From his high vantage point, he continued to hurl javelins with terrifying force, his great strength allowing him to pierce through Macedonian shields that would have resisted a lesser man. His elephant, too, fought with a desperate animalistic loyalty. Even as the beast was peppered with arrows and its hide was rent by the curved blades of the Macedonian kopis, it continued to gore and stomp, creating a small bloody island of defiance in a sea of defeat. Alexander, observing from his position with the companion cavalry, was struck by the sight. He had faced many kings. Darius had fled at Gaugamela long before the final blow was struck, but he had never seen a ruler who so thoroughly embodied the martial spirit of his people. The Macedonian king desired to capture Porus alive, not merely as a trophy, but as a recognition of a peer. He sent Taxiles, the Indian king who had sided with the Macedonians, to urge Porus to surrender. But the sight of his rival was an insult to the wounded Porus. He turned his elephant toward Taxiles and leveled a javelin, forcing the turncoat king to flee for his life. Alexander was undeterred. He sent others, including Meroes, an old friend of Porus, who finally managed to approach the weary giant. By this time, Porus was faint from loss of blood. His elephant, sensing its master's exhaustion, knelt with a gentle, mourning groan to allow him to dismount. As Porus stepped onto the blood-soaked earth, he stood tall despite his wounds, a king who had lost his army but retained his dignity. When he was finally brought before Alexander, the two men stood in silence for a moment, the conqueror looking up at the conquered. The Greek historian Arrian records that Alexander was the first to speak, asking through an interpreter how Porus wished to be treated. The Indian king's response was as brief as it was profound. "Treat me, Alexander, as a king." When Alexander pressed him for a further request, Porus replied that all things are contained in that one request. This moment marked a rare instance where Alexander's ambition was checked by genuine respect. He not only restored Porus to his throne, but also expanded his territory, granting him dominion over neighboring tribes that the Macedonians had subdued. It was a pragmatic move, securing a loyal satrap on the edge of the known world, but it was also a recognition of the sheer human cost of the Hydaspes. The victory had been total, but the price had been paid in the coin of Alexander's most precious resource, the morale of his men. The Macedonians had lost hundreds of their veterans, and the number of wounded ran into the thousands. The horses, too, had suffered. Among the casualties was Bucephala, the legendary black stallion that had carried Alexander from the plains of Thessaly to the banks of the Hydaspes. The horse, nearly 30 years old, had survived the battle only to succumb to his wounds or the sheer exhaustion of age shortly after. Alexander founded the city of Bucephala on the site of his death, a monument to a companion that had been with him since his youth. The aftermath of the battle was a somber affair. The Macedonian camp was not filled with the usual jubilant celebrations of victory. Instead, there was a heavy, oppressive silence. The soldiers looked at the shattered remains of the elephants, the piles of their own dead, and the endless horizon of the Indian interior, and for the first time the end of the world felt like a lie. They had been told that beyond the Hydaspes lay only a short march to the great ocean that encircled the earth. Instead, they heard rumors of even greater armies, of kings who commanded thousands of elephants and millions of infantrymen on the banks of the Ganges. The monsoon rains began to fall in earnest, turning the ground into a permanent mire and rotting their clothes and leather equipment. Sickness began to spread through the ranks, dysentery and fever claiming those the Indian pikes had missed. The push toward the river Hydaspes became a psychological slog. The men were no longer fighting for glory or for Alexander's vision of a unified empire. They were fighting simply because they were told to move forward. When they reached the Hydaspes, the soldiers finally broke. The mutiny was not a violent uprising, but a collective, wary refusal to go a step further. Alexander, who had never lost a battle, had finally lost his army. He spent 3 days in his tent, fuming and grieving, before finally conceding. He ordered 12 massive altars to be built, as tall as siege towers, dedicated to the gods who had brought them this far. It was a face-saving gesture, a way to mark the limit of his reach with a veneer of divine sanction. The retreat from the Hydaspes was perhaps more grueling than the advance. Alexander led his forces down the Indus, a journey marked by brutal sieges of local tribes who resisted the passing army. At the city of the Malians, Alexander nearly lost his life when he leaped alone into the enemy stronghold, a move born of frustration and a desperate need to remind his men of his divinity. He survived, but the wound to his lung would plague him for the rest of his short life. By the time the army reached the Gedrosian desert, the triumph of the Hydaspes felt like an ancient, bitter memory. Thousands more would die in the heat and sand of the desert, a final cruel tax on the ambition that had driven them to the edge of the world. In the long view of history, the Battle of the Hydaspes stands as a pivot point. It was Alexander's last great masterpiece of tactical genius, a demonstration of how a smaller, more disciplined force could overcome the most terrifying weapons of the ancient world. Yet it also proved that there were limits to even the most legendary will.
The kingdom of Porus remained, a buffer state that would eventually be absorbed into the rising Mauryan Empire. The Greeks left behind cities and a cultural legacy that would blend with Indian traditions, creating the unique Greco-Buddhist art of the Gandhara region. But for the men who stood in the mud on that July day in 326 BCE, history was not about legacies or cultural exchange. It was about the weight of a sarissa, the smell of elephant dung and blood, and the realization that the world was far larger and far more indifferent to their conquest than they had ever imagined. The Hydaspes did not just stop an army, it broke a dream of universal empire, leaving only the boring reality of borders, logistics, and the inevitable decay of all things made by man. As the river continued its eternal flow toward the sea, it washed away the blood of the fallen, leaving the land to wait for the next conqueror, while the ghosts of the Macedonians began their long, slow march into the footnotes of time. The silence that followed the battle was not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion. The soldiers of the phalanx, their hands calloused and their spirits frayed, began the process of cleaning their armor, a task that seemed futile in the humid air of the Punjab. They spoke in hushed tones about the home they might never see again, about the wives and children who were now more like figments of a dream than reality. Alexander, meanwhile, sat in his pavilion, looking at the maps of a world he had failed to fully grasp. He had conquered the kings of the earth, but the earth itself remained conquered. The Hydaspes was his greatest victory and also his most profound defeat. It was the moment the legend of Alexander the Great reached its zenith and began its slow, inevitable descent. The sun set over the river, casting long, distorted shadows across the battlefield, where the broken bodies of men and beasts lay in a final, egalitarian embrace. History in its cold and unyielding way had moved on, leaving only the echoes of the trumpets and the fading ripples of the river to tell the tale of the day the world was almost won. And in that stillness, the true nature of conquest was revealed, not as a glorious march, but as a heavy, wearying weight that eventually crushes the very hands that try to hold it. The legacy of the battle was cemented not in the gold of the spoils, but in the exhaustion of the spirit. The Macedonian Empire was a brilliant, fleeting flash in the pan of history, a spark that ignited and then vanished, leaving behind a changed world that would never quite remember the specifics of the struggle. The elephants were gone, the kings were dead, and the river Hydaspes continued to flow, indifferent to the names of those who had died on its banks. The story of Alexander is often told as a series of triumphs, but at its heart it is a story of the distance between human ambition and the reality of the physical world. The Hydaspes was the place where those two things finally and irrevocably collided. In the end, the only thing that remained was the history, detailed, complex, and in its own way profoundly boring in its repetitive cycle of rise and fall. As the soldiers began their retreat, they left behind not just a battlefield, but the youth of an era. The age of the great conquerors was drawing to a close, and the long, slow march of the centuries was just beginning. The river kept its secrets, and the dust of the Punjab settled over the bones of the fallen, waiting for the next chapter of an endless, repetitive human drama. History had found its limit, and the world simply moved on.